I thought we could talk tonight about creativity, and I call the talk tonight "Creativity's Muse." Right. So, Muse is from the ancient world. It was considered one of the goddesses that provided inspiration to um, writers and singers and musicians, etc. And in the ancient world, when an artist was beginning their creation, say something that was written, a play, for example, they would often dedicate it to um, the muse, um, sort of in recognition that that source of creativity or inspiration was somehow, beyond their grasp, and they were making a request, really, saying, I'm beginning in this endeavor. Um, will you help me? Will you ins- create the inspiration? So even the word word music um, actually came from the same source, from the Greek musica, which is the um, the art of the muses. Right? That was the meaning of that term. And it also meant, in the ancient world, something of wonder, of awe. Um, and even today, the word like to muse means to sort of reflect on, to meditate on, um, to contemplate. So it has a really rich background of having to do with inspiration and creativity and wonder and awe and contemplation. And so this is a source that isn't within our control. Right? So it's, we can do something to um, make ourselves available to this source of creativity. It's almost like, the flowers can't demand that the honeybees show up to pollinate them, but what they can do is, exude some fragrance and hope that the bees will be attracted, or other insects. So it's more like that. It's more like doing what we can to create um, the an attractive scent, you could say, to bring something into this world, into form through these body minds. So, we can, just cite some examples, like an artist, if, may require years and years of practice to hone their skills, learn how the techniques of painting, and can be a skilled painter, technically skilled, and there still may or may not be, true inspiration happening. If there's not, it can be um, technically good, but if there's some creative um, juice there, then the artist may not be able to explain exactly what that is or how it happened, but or the viewer may not be able to say exactly what it is that they find so attractive about the piece of art. But there's a difference, right? It can be sensed into, but it can't be grasped. It can't be demanded. But it's something that can happen. Um, so it's not like the technical skills, the years of practice are unnecessary. One doesn't become a master artist overnight just because one might happen to, have an evening of inspiration. Any more than enlightenment qualifies you to be an eye surgeon, for example, right? It's the technical skills are still required. Um, you take another example seemingly unrelated, but let's just take the example of a caregiver or a parent of, say, a 4-year-old child. And, the, someone who's a parent or caregiver obviously knows how to take care of a small child, keep the child safe. Um, but if that's all the caregiver is doing, it's not very entertaining for the child, right? But if the caregiver could sort of step out of their role, not that they would let anything bad happen, but they could just step out of their role long enough to engage with the child at, um, uh, together with the child's creativity, right? Um, we had a young woman staying with us for a couple of months, Cookie, who was practiced improv theater. And she explained that one of the ways they do that is whatever the other person says, you don't deny it. You don't try to correct it or change it. You go with it. It's always like yes, and then you add to the story from there. That's the whole one of the important parameters that make that work. And it's quite similar actually with a small child. If you're working with their creativity, and as an adult, the role can be yes, and then add something to it, and then there can be magic happen. Where there's a true interactive relationship where you're not being the parent. You're not trying to teach the child anything. You're not trying to, be the smart one in the room. Um, you're just interacting on a completely creative level playing field, and doing your best to try to keep up, because a child's imagination is um, in all likelihood, um, still fresh, right? And so it's actually very enlivening to engage with a child that hasn't been conditioned too much in that way. And also scientists, some of the great scientific discoveries have happened out of a moment of um, what's often described as just idle daydreaming. Clearly they, studied their field for maybe years, maybe decades. Um, but the really surprising discoveries often come out of not, mental slaving uh, to try to find the answer. They may have done that for years, but then maybe they're just gazing out the window and forgetting all about the science, and something about that, um, whether that happened, you know, knowingly or not, but something about that where the mind just relaxes, opens up, is not in the conceptual mode, and available to something else, an inspiration, right? Almost like from the beyond, from somewhere outside of ourselves, that um, almost like the word inspiration, like inhale, breathe in something that's um, not within our conceptualizing mind. So Einstein said something interesting um, about it. He said, imagination is much more important than knowledge. The knowledge is limited. Um, Imagination encircles the entire world. Right? He also characterized creativity as intelligence having fun. Right, so it's like more of an interactive play with something that is beyond us. It's not just conceptualizing within our own mind, but really becoming available to something beyond us that we can um, sort of hopefully induce into this world, into form. Right? So if it's just, if we're trying to do something out of just, sheer mental willpower, um, the result, might be clever, might be a valid comment on the human condition, might explain, psychological tendencies. All of that's within the possibility of conceptual thought. But it suggests that it, just through our mental capacities, we won't rise to the level of, creative insight, just a different way of approaching something that is surprising, that we would not necessarily have thought of had we just, plowed straight ahead towards, with sheer willpower. So what we're talking about here is also, I'm not talking about the subconscious. I'm not talking about, dredging things up from the subconscious into the conscious. Um, you can do that to a certain extent with mindfulness, where our unconscious um, habits or speech or actions, if we're being more mindful, then we notice these certain patterns that may not be that skillful. And, you know, just by the sheer noticing of them, um, they lose their power over us. We may still feel that impulse to move or say or act in a certain way, but that awareness uh, doesn't let it go the next step. So we find ourselves acting, saying things with a little more in alignment with how we'd really like to be. So that way, we can take things that you could say are subconscious, that we bring them into consciousness, um, and then we cease to be controlled by them. Yogis have been able to control their body temperature or their heartbeat or something that most of us can't do. But there's a limit to um, what we can dredge up from this subconscious. It seems like there's always many hidden memories or stories that are um, buried there for one reason or another, and that's as it is. But what we're talking about here is not that. We're not talking about within this body mind pulling stuff up from our subconscious. That would be pulling things up from the past, the known, the well-trodden road. What we're talking about here is something really outside of this body-mind framework. So when I was growing up, I felt as a teenager, and before that too, I guess, but it was clear as a teenager, um, and through my 20s, that I was not creative in any way, period. And I would, in school, avoid any classes that had to do with writing. Um, Creative writing or even essays, any kind of writing, or even much reading, I would just not take those courses. And I managed to do that. Um, and just because I felt like I wasn't creative and I couldn't imagine how a person could write something that um, just out of the blue like that. So I always felt much safer in math and science. The facts were there. All you had to do was learn how they work, and you were good to go. So it wasn't actually until I was in my 30s that I found myself designing buildings. And I guess it started out because it seemed like fairly concrete work. It was objective, and I wasn't, I didn't go into it thinking it was a creative effort. But then what I realized is when I was trying to do it, too much from my head, it would never work. It was a lot of mental effort with unsatisfactory results. Then I learned that it was also possible to just rest and relax and be open. And in those times, things sort of flowed easily, productively. I was happy with the results, and um, and I realized that that sort of creative impulse um, was was coming from somewhere else. It wasn't something I could demand or control, or um, it would show up or not, and but I could influence whether it did or didn't, just by whether I was available for it or not. But if I tried to grasp it, it'd be like trying to grasp air. The more you tried to grasp it, the more elusive it seemed. It was sort of shy that way. So what I realized is my first um, um, suspicion about creativity was correct, that I, as a separate individual, wasn't creative, never will be, right? But there's such a thing as having um, being open to it, to receiving it. Um, so it's not a personal thing. It's not a personal possession. It's not in the possession of some people and not others. It's a question of how open and receptive we are to that possibility, right? So this sense of creativity was quite a surprise for me. I was probably in my mid-30s before I discovered that, and it was astonishing to find out what that what that actually was, and to learn to trust it. Um, some of the well-known teachers, Adyashanti or Eckhart or Nisargadatta, have all talked about not knowing what they're going to say next when they say it, um, and not remembering what they've said after they've said it. It's just in that moment, it's available to say. I remember Eckhart on one retreat said something, and it was I don't remember what it was, but it was a fairly profound statement. And someone asked him to repeat it, and they had to coax it out of him because he couldn't. And it was just like the previous sentence, but he couldn't remember what it was. And then when he finally did remember, he said it again, but it wasn't compelling at all because it was just coming from memory at that point. It was very, very interesting. So these teachers don't claim that what they're talking about is, their own possession as wisdom, right? Um, they're quite clear that it's not theirs. They talk about having um, knowing what they need to know when they need to know it, not before, not afterwards. So it's not even um, data bank that they go to. It's just made available, right? And to trust that um, is well, it's quite an amazing process because we as people are participating in that. It's like the inspiration still needs this form, our body minds, to participate in it, to bring it into this life, into form. Um, and yet we're not the source of that. So since we're not the source of that, then it would be improper to take credit for it, right? It's sort of like, if you're expecting a letter from your beloved, and the mailman comes up to the door, and in the mail there's your letter from beloved. You don't kiss the mailman, right? I mean, you might be grateful that the mailman sort of faithfully delivered your mail to your door, um, but you're quite clear who your beloved is, right? So this is an error that a lot of seekers make about their, um, if they relate to a guru in a certain way, mistaking the mailman for the beloved. There can be a huge amount of respect and gratitude, um, and yet uh, the guru, if he or she is quite clear, they know that the source is beyond. Right? Um, so our job is to receive, to be receptive, um, and to distort the transmission as little as possible. Right? Um, if the transmission is distorted by, our thoughts, our beliefs, our ideas about who we are and what we're doing, then that flow from beyond, whether we're talking about creativity or, um, just how we act in the world, that flow will come through these body minds in a distorted kind of way, right? Same life energy, right? Same awareness, just gets distorted by um, a misinterpretation of what we truly are. Okay, so this creative process is really bringing something from the, you could say, from beyond us, from the formless into form, requires our participation. Um, so we can't force that. We can't make that happen. We can't insist on it. We can invite it. So there's several things that we can do. Um, the first thing that we can do is to just recognize and honor and appreciate and be grateful for um, the source of inspiration. Right? But just being available, recognize that it's not coming from our own bootstraps, it's coming from something beyond our um, willful control, um, and that our job is to be available for that. So there's lots of examples where artists or musicians or writers um, have maybe had an initial success, maybe some fame, uh, and then it's like, where do they go from there? So maybe the initial success, there was a certain amount of freedom. They had nothing to lose. They could take chances. They had probably had time to spend in idle daydreaming. Um, they had a freedom, right? There's no expectations. If they failed, well, you know, young budding artists, are expected to fail. So, um, but if you have the first success, well, now things have changed, right? Now there's an expectation. Now there's something to live up to. Now there's, your fame or respectability to protect. And, so the question then becomes, what do you do second time? There's a pretty interesting documentary on Netflix that may still be there, I'm not sure, but it was called The Pixar Story, and talking about the computer animated um, group that did things such as Toy Story and Cars, etc. And they had exactly this question. Like this first success was so beyond their expectations. There was a real concern about, well, what do we do next, right? And fortunately, um, they were willing to continue to take chances, right? Um, Major chances, and that level of freshness, willingness to be open, willingness to do something just totally new. Um, kept it fresh. And I mean, they were dealing in the medium where not only the story required creativity, but even um, the computer animation, technical aspects of it required an enormous creativity there as well. Um, I think there was another example that came to mind. There was an author, I'm not sure if he's still around or not, Norman Mailer, who had some early successes. Um, and then I remember sometime hearing, I mean, it might have been, I don't know, 20 years ago or more now, that I remember hearing him say that he wanted to write the great American novel, and even then I thought at the time, it doesn't sound quite right, you know. It sounded like, too much of, personal will, personal ambition, seeking fame, seeking glory in there was much more than about um, being open to creativity. And it's almost like um, the muse of writing doesn't like that um, sort of greed, that level of ambition. So he never did. He never wrote a novel that rose to that level. On the other hand, we have someone like Michelangelo, who was like a fountain that flowed his whole life. Um, just enormously creative, enormously productive, and his on his deathbed, his dying words were, um, "I could have done more." Right? Just it had the ring of, to me, anyway, it had the ring of humbleness. Um, sort of gratitude for what had flowed through him, and yet the recognition that um, he had somehow uh, he could have done more. He had somehow come up short for what was possible, what was available. Um, so this first thing that we can do is really honor the source of this. Um, just recognize that it is not to our credit. We still have to participate. We still have to bring our best to the game, but the source of the inspiration is beyond us, right? As is the source of life itself, right? So the second thing we can do is we can learn to listen. So by learn to listen, we can't listen um, if we're busy talking, right? Whereas, that includes talking in our head, talking to ourselves. Um, so, to distinguish the one true small voice among the many voices that are happening in our heads is difficult if what's happening in our head is noisy, right? So one of the things we can do is just um, do what we can to just lessen the volume. And the way we can do that is to allow the thoughts to be um, and to understand the mechanism of those thoughts arising. So it's not figuring out all the thoughts, that we don't have enough time in this lifetime to do that, right? But what we can do is see the mechanism of thinking, the mechanism of our mind's insistence on conceptualizing everything. That we can do, right? We can see the mind's tendency to, want to judge everything of whether or not it's good for me. So we can see that. Um, and if we see it clearly enough, it just loses its power. So we're not being opposed to it. Being opposed to it empowers it. Seeing it clearly without opposition or judgment um, takes the level down. So we can, um, mind will quiet over time. Maybe never completely, and that's okay. But just quiet enough that we can listen to more subtle voices, more subtle um, suggestions. Okay, so when by this still small voice, what um, we can recognize it by certain characteristics. So um, it won't argue, it won't say why, won't insist, won't demand that you do what it's suggesting. I mean, it doesn't have to, right? It's reality. So it can just suggest you can take it or leave it, right? I mean, the little voice won't even say, no, 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 don't do that. It will just offer just a little little gift. And so that's the second thing we can do is just get quiet enough that we can recognize when we're being offered something. Okay. The third thing we can do is obviously um, respond to what's being offered. We don't have to, you know, but we may learn over time that we really we really want to, right? It's really a good idea. We don't have to. We can go ignore it and go down some other road, and um, might find out next week or 5 years from now that maybe that was a detour that I didn't need to take, but that's what happened. I learned something along the way, so um, here we are. Okay? So it's just a quiet voice, right? But we can learn to respond to that voice when we hear it, recognize it, and then just learn to move with it. So it's not like I mean, it can be, I suppose, but it's not generally like a voice spoken in our head like we would hear someone talking to us. Could happen that way, maybe that sometimes does, but it's more a sense of just like a fresh breeze or a little nudge or suggestion. Just you feel an intuition to move this way instead of that way. Or maybe there's a sense of discomfort into continuing down the path that we've been going down for some time, and there's just this movement of maybe something else is called for. It's usually quite gentle that way. Of course, if we ignore it long enough, then you know maybe the divine has to yell, and then um, you don't want to push it that far if you don't have to. So we can learn to move that way. And after a while, it doesn't become like, oh, there's the voice. I'll move that way. After a while, it just becomes sort of that's how life feels. You just um, get out of your conceptualizing mind enough that you just tend to move without having to go through the thought process. Oh, do you think that's the small voice that's trying to tell me something? Maybe it is. That. Um, it's just like trainer wheels maybe, but after a while you don't have to use that. It just feels like more like life goes in this direction, and it just is how life feels. Um, and it may be that at first it's fairly rare that we recognize what that is. Um, and then we learn what it is and learn to respect it and respond to it, um, recognize it, and uh, and it seems like that level, giving our attention to it, causes it to uh, be more and more a part of our life. Right? So it no longer feels like a one-off event now and again. It's just how life moves, more or less, continuously, day to day. And that's the feel of it. Um, So this creativity coming into form. I mean, we talk about the creation, right? The world, was created, you know, the Big Bang so many billion years ago. Um, but in this way of looking at it, we're really talking about a continuous process of creation, where we are participants in that by recognizing um, a movement that comes out of the formless and our um, co-creative role in manifesting that through our own being into this world, into form. Okay, that's what we can do. Meister Eckhart, who was just a 14th century German Catholic mystic um, and bishop and artist, and it was quite extraordinary. Um, had this wonderful expression. It said that God is always begetting the only begotten. Always happening. It's always happening. The only begotten is this entire manifestation, is the one manifestation, always begetting the only begotten. Right? And what is coming into form and going back into the formless is a continuous process. We can see that all around us, and yet it is um, it is this continual flow of creativity, and we get to participate in that. Um, it's not reserved for artists or scientists or musicians. It's our birthright. It is what these body minds spend a lifetime doing, expressing something that is unique to each of us. That creativity is our life, is how we choose to express our life, however that looks. Um, and the more we can understand that the inspiration for that, the actual life energy itself, um, the awareness that we are, the, the more transparent these body minds can be to that flow, the more creative our lives look. So the only um, people that aren't creative are the ones that believe that they're not. That's the power of belief. If we believe that what we are is limited to this body, this mind, our memories, our past our hopes, our fears, our dreams, then, that's not where creativity resides. It's the recognition that what we essentially are is this formless awareness. That is the direction from which this creative impulse arises. And what we find out eventually is the muse isn't up on some mountaintop somewhere. It's actually what we are. It's not what we are as in this body mind, but it is what we are in terms of this formless awareness within which all of this happens, this entire creation happens, within the awareness that each of us can directly experience. And it's actually from this awareness, from this emptiness, in a sense, um, this awareness without attributes, that that life appears as a fulfillment of that. It's because of that emptiness that life is fulfilling. If we try to, any other way that we define it is limited. It's really this openness, this receptivity, this boundlessness is what is free, is what is unlimited. And within that, there's a sense of there being enough freedom to allow whatever arises to arise, to enjoy our participation in that. And that is how that creativity is expressed through these body minds. Right? So we get to enjoy everything and own nothing. That's the freedom of it.